I want to present our next speaker, Marco. He has a very huge experience in .NET platform. He started working with that starting from the first beta versions. As well, he has a very huge experience around Microsoft Azure. And I think all of you remember this first version of Azure Portal with Silverlight. And you know, our next speaker he's worked with that starting from that version. He had MVP for 13 years in a row. And this is a huge experience, and I want to congratulate him. And he will start our next session about building multi-pass application on Windows Azure. Marco, stage yours.
Hello, guys. Greetings from London. Really great to be here, at least virtually. Hopefully, we will meet all together live very, very soon. So, my name is Marco, and in the past few years, I've been working with a company that works in the SaaS business, software as a service business. And while we were developing and architecting the application, I was like, wow, there were so many interesting challenges. I was like, oh yeah, I need to make a talk about it. And here I am. So we're going to talk about building a software as a service applications, which are multi-tenant with ASP.NET Core and a little bit of Azure. Conscious of the time, conscious of the fact that this is a mostly .NET focused conference, I will hit the gas more on the ASP.NET Core side, but there will be some Azure as well. So what are we going to talk about? So first and foremost, we're going to use this application as a playground. Think of it as a Slack clone made by someone who can't design a proper website like me. But it will still serve the purpose of to help us illustrating some of the concepts which characterize this type of applications. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about multi-tenancy, right? So what is multi-tenancy is many clients coexisting in the same infrastructure. When that happens, there's a a huge problem that you're going to face, which is ensuring that data is kept isolated over time, right? Then we're going to talk about creating a delivery network. This is the part that usually takes a much longer time during the talk, but I will skip it a little bit. But we will focus on how we can provide custom domains to our different customers and still have one application deployed. And last but not least, no applications, especially for the enterprise, will ever be considered nowadays if you don't support corporate single sign-on. So we will have a glimpse of that part as well. How can we leverage the identity providers of our customers to ensure that their users can access our application securely? Right. Before we get started, let me just add a disclaimer. This is not the best solution ever. I don't want to give you the best solution ever. I wouldn't be able to. As always, context is king. Your mileage may vary, but this is hopefully going to serve the purpose of giving you some inspiration on how to tackle some of the challenges that you might face if you are going to work with this type of applications. Okay, so let's start talking about data isolation. And I bet that every one of you has been thinking, but why can I just not have a where with my company D equals to Acme to separate the data? Well, what's wrong with that? It does work, right? The problem is if we forget about it, right? So obviously in a query like this is not a huge risk, but what if you have a query like this, right? In which you have complex joins, cities, many different filters. And it's very easy in this case to make a mistake, make a bug, and leak some data that you don't want to. And when that happens, obviously what happens is that your user from Acme sees data from Contoso and Fabricam, and therefore your reputation is forever ruined. Your product has gone bust. So can we make this a little bit more secure than just sticking a where condition? Well, the answer is yes, by using some features of a feature of the SQL Server called row-level security, which is not available just in SQL Server. It's available pretty much in all the modern databases, such as MySQL, Postgres, etc. And the concept is to stick a context to the user when the user is connecting to the database, right? This context might contain the company ID. So for example, for the blue user is going to be Acme, and for the green user is going to be Contoso. And then what we're going to do is defining a policy in the database that says, okay, only return a row from a chat rooms, for example, if the company ID of the user, right? So this one in the context matches the company ID in the rows, right? So effectively, what we're going to do is creating different views over this chat rooms table, right? The blue user will see this, right? The green user will see something like that, okay? So let's have a look at how this works in Visual Studio and SQL Server. Right, so let me jump to Visual Studio, and let's first get acquainted with the application for a second. So I have basically a simple solution which has an API built in SPF Core Web API, and the UI is built in Blazor, but simply because I really struggle with JavaScript. Hopefully you are better than me. But yeah, don't worry, there's nothing really specific about Blazor. You can reuse the same concepts with any front-end technology that you want to use. And if we tried to run this application, what we would get would be something like this, right? In which, for example, I'm now connecting to company D equals to Acme, right? Bear with me. I know that this is horrible having it in query string, but we're going to fix it quite soon. Right? When I log in with Acme, I see only data from Acme. If I switch to Contoso, the application loads and I only see data from Contoso. Okay. Under the hood, what's happening is that the front end is calling this rooms controller in the services stack, which has this get all rooms async, for example, where I'm filtering by company ID. And just bear in mind that I'm retrieving the current company of the user by this abstraction that I have created, this iCompany context accessor, right? Which is very simple. It just returns this company context and the company ID. I have one implementation which is based on the routing, right? The idea to abstract it is because then I can make it better during the talk and change the strategy. How do I retrieve the company ID? Right now, what is the problem with this? The problem is obviously that, as we expect, if I forget this and recompile the application, I run it, what will happen is that I will leak all the data to the wrong company, right? So if for example, I go back to my enterprise chat, I'm in Contoso and I see this data, which is Acme's data. Okay, so how can pro-level security help me with this? Well, in order to explain that, we need to head to SQL Management Studio and start configuring our database. So the first thing that we need to do is creating a separate schema. The reason of this will be clearer in a minute. And once I've created the schema, now let's imagine that I have this table here in which I have my ID, name, and company ID for all the rooms, right? So what we want to do is creating a function, right, like this one, which will receive a company ID and will basically return 1 if the user has access to that company ID, okay? And how do we do that? Well, in my case, for example, I'm just saying, yeah, return 1 either if the user is an admin, right? Or this is the new concept probably for most of you. If the session context and its key company ID has a value that is the same as this company ID that I set as a parameter, okay? Then I can do the same thing for the messages. Here, there's just a little twist because there's no company ID. There's just a link with the room ID, but I leave it to you to have a look at how this function works, right? Under the hood, what the code is. Then once I have my two functions, I can start creating my policies, right? So for example, here I'm creating a policy which I'm calling room filter, right? And this policy is over the table rooms, right? And I'm adding, for example, a filter predicate that uses this function that I've just defined, passing the company ID. This is, as you can see, it's the company ID. Let me zoom this in a little bit. It's the company ID of the column of the rooms table, okay? And I've added this filter predicate and also a block predicate for inserts and updates, right? So a user from Contoso cannot update, for example, a room in Acme, right? And I'm doing the same thing for the messages here, okay? Now, last step. Obviously, we've seen in our functions that an admin user can always see everything, right? So we need to use a limited user when connecting to this database. And that's why I've created this chat app user, right? So for example, let me just run this script. So I'm going to use this to connect to the database. And as you can see, this user has only access to DBO as a schema. This means that it will not be able to change the policies that we just defined because they are in a separate schema, security. That's the reason why we create everything in this separate schema. Right, now we're done. Right, now if I do a select star from my rooms and messages, right, as you can see here, I'm getting data from Acme and Contoso. This is because I'm an admin, right? But let's see what happens the moment that I impersonate this chat app user, and I'm also setting the session context company ID to be Acme, okay, with this stored procedure sp set session context, right? I run this. Now I run exactly the same query as before, and as you can see now, this is only return me Acme data, okay? I can switch to Contoso. I execute exactly the same query, and all of a sudden, I only get data from Contoso, okay? Now, why is this really interesting? Because, oh, well, forget that. What happens if I try to insert a room as Acme, right? While I'm being Contoso, I get blocked, obviously, okay? Because we have that policy. Now, that's the interesting bit also. So what happens if I forget to add a session context? That is pretty much like the equivalent of forgetting a where condition, right? If I forget that, so what is the expectation? Well, that is why I find this really interesting. So in that case, I don't get anything returned by the database, okay? It will obviously be a bug, right? But at least the safety of the data is ensured. Obviously, the data is still there, right? I revert, I go back being an administrator, and I can see everything here again. All right, so how do we integrate this with our application? So the first thing is that I need to connect using a different connection string, the one that uses the chat app user, right? I can't be an admin. I'm using entity framework in this case, but obviously these concepts are valid whichever technology you're using to connect to the database, right? So I'm just switching the connection string here. And then I needed to set that session context. And the way I'm doing, this is specific to entity framework, but there are other solutions for Dapper, etc. that you can engineer. But in case of entity framework, I'm leveraging this feature called the DB command interceptor. So this is a class that entity framework will call just before sending a command to the database. So for example, you have your link query, right? EF will parse the expression tree, generate the SQL, and just before sending it to the database, we'll call one of these three methods here: non-query executing, reader executing, or scalar executing, passing that DB command. And what I'm doing here is that for each command, I'm calling this add session context, right? Which will basically do a little bit of a control the SQL injection. So I'm prepending in the command text this exec sp set session context where I'm passing the company ID, right? And then obviously appending the original command, right? And I'm retrieving the company ID with the same company context accessors that we've seen before, okay? Now, I just needed to go here on my DB context, register it in this way. And now let's try to rerun the application, right? And as you can remember, I still have the nasty bug here where I've forgotten to set the where condition, right? Now, when I reload Contoso, anyway, right, even if I have a bug, right, as you can see, I can only see data from Contoso. And this is the safety net provided by row-level security that has helped me avoiding this nasty bug, okay? Cool. So first goal accomplished, we managed to isolate the data a little bit better with row-level security. Now let's talk about the delivery of the content, okay? So what is the goal of this part? Well, obviously we're going to deploy our application in in Azure, on-prem, wherever, in a couple of web services, one for the UI, one for the API, right? What we want is that our users will access our system by acme.enterprise chat or contoso.enterprise chat or anything.enterprise chat. What we want is basically to build something that connects the dots, right? So can route the traffic, for example, here or here, right? Depending on the traffic. Now, this is the bit in the middle that we're going to talk about, okay? Now, the first thing that we need is obviously configuring a DNS, right? I'm using an Azure DNS, but it doesn't really matter, right? We need a DNS and we need obviously a public IP where we can point our DNS. And the recommendation here is to use a wildcard domain, right? So a star domain like this one, in which, let me zoom this in which I have my star domain associated to my public IP address here, okay? The result of this is that if I go to the terminal, right, and I do, for example, resolve DNS name acme.enterprise chat, I will get this IP address. If I do the same for Contoso, I will get this IP address, the same address. If I do this with anything, right, I will get the same address, right? Obviously, if we want to deliver this in HTTPS, we also need a wildcard certificate, right, which might be a little bit more expensive. The good news is that we can get one for free with the Let's Encrypt, for example, like I've done, right? After that, we will need to create this delivery network. Now, this is the bit that I'm gonna skip during this presentation. However, in the slides that you can download, there will be an example with screenshots on how to configure a app gateway in Azure to serve the purpose that I'm describing here. What I want to point your attention to is that eventually what this delivery network will do is transforming this Acme Contoso custom domain into the parameters that we've seen using in our actual code, which are either the query string for the website, or it could be a path, for example, for the backend API. Okay. Now, this has a profound implication on how we write our software. Simply because if we are building a pure single page application that just runs on the browser, static HTML, right? That code in the browser obviously will always see this, right? Even if we have that delivery network that transforms the parameter in the second level domain into this parameter in query string, that will happen on a server to server. So we need a server side component, okay? And the other thing is that we will need to configure our UI for the client-specific configurations. So, for example, what is the name of the client that we need to display in the UI? Well, what if they have a specific theme or something like that, right? So there's this mixture of server-side and client-side things that we will need to combine. Now, what is the general idea here then? So the idea is that when I bootstrap my single-page application, right, on my website, the first thing that I do before displaying anything is that this application will make a call to the backend on the same URL, but with this configuration path, okay? This will be grabbed by my reverse proxy that I have as an entry point, transformed into this thing here that can be read on the server side, and then this configuration endpoint can return some client-specific configuration that my UI might use. So, for example, in this case, it's very trivial, just the company ID, company name, whatever, right? But we will make it more interesting later on, okay? So this is basically the general idea. So let's have a look at how this works in practice. So let me go back to Visual Studio. I need to quickly switch to a different branch. So let me go to delivery here. And in this delivery branch, as you can see, what I've done is I've added a second UI project, right? This is an ASP.NET Core project that basically serves the Blazor application, okay? So we have my home controller, and the home controller, well, in this case, it's just looking at whether the company ID which will receive in the query string is either Contoso or Acme, and then it will either return a not found if the name is not valid, or will return the bootstrap for my Blazor application here. Okay. Obviously, in a normal scenario, you're gonna have this being read from a database or something like that. Okay. Then this will bootstrap Blazor, right? And in Blazor, right, what I've done in my program.cs, right, when Blazor starts, right, as a first thing, right, what I do is creating an HTTP client that points to my base address, as you can see, right? And then I'm using this HTTP client, right, to call this configuration endpoint. Okay, so I'm making this call here. This will be captured by this configuration controller that I have in my server-side UI, right? And this configuration controller, for now, will just return the company ID and, for example, the API URL that I'm going to use. Okay, so very, very simple. Then back to Blazor, we add this to the configuration, right? So that we can retrieve this additional configuration just like any other configuration key. So for example, in my nav menu, when I'm going to display team Acme or team Contoso here, right? As you can see, I'm just reading it from the configuration like it was any other static parameter in app settings. Okay, so you get the idea. All right. Does it work? Hopefully. Let's go. I've already deployed it to Azure, so let me quickly go to acme.enterprise chat. Let me open. Let me just refresh this. Right. As you can see, now I am. When the application starts, it calls this configuration endpoint here, right? And what this configuration endpoint returns is exactly what we described in the code and in the slides before. Okay, so that is basically how we can deal with that. I go to Contoso and I get pretty much the same behavior. Okay, configuration endpoint and then rooms for Contoso. All right, so we managed to do to achieve our first two goals, right? So we built a multi-tenant networking. Again, the details of the networking are in the slides. Unfortunately, there's no time to discuss them in the talk, but I think that it's really useful to save that time to discuss the enterprise security. But before I do that, sorry, I forgot about it. Let me just quickly deploy a new version of the code which includes the security into Azure. Let me just trigger this deploy here. And in the meantime that this runs, let's go back to the slides. All right, so back to the slides. Enterprise-ready security, corporate single sign-on. So what is the tricky bit here? Well, the tricky bit is that our clients will use any given identity provider. So Acme might be in Azure Active Directory, Microsoft 365, Contoso might be using Okta, Fabrica might be using Auth0, and if we need to build an application that can integrate with all these providers, that is going to become very, very problematic quite soon, right? So what is the alternative idea? The alternative idea is to use an identity provider which acts as a bridge between your code and these federated providers, right? In my case, I've chosen for this presentation Azure AD B2C, right? It doesn't have to be Azure AD B2C. It can be your identity server. It could be, for example, in the client which I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, we're using Auth0, right? It's just for the sake of this presentation. And the benefit of this is that your application will always interact with the same identity provider, basically. So you only write one type of code. Now, I appreciate that some of you might not have used Azure AD B2C yet, right? However, I'm to keep it very simple, we're going to use only 3 features promised of Azure AD B2C in order for this to work, okay? And the first feature we're going to look at is called identity providers. So what is the idea here? Azure AD B2C can integrate with a number of external identity providers like Apple, Facebook, GitHub, etc. Right? The idea is to leverage these generic OpenID Connect providers, right, and create one per client that we want to work with, right? So we're going to create one for Acme, one for Contoso. And what do we need in order to create one of these providers? But the good news is that we only have to ask for three things to our customers, right? One is the metadata URL that each of these identity provider will have. And then we need to tell them to create a typical application in their, for example, Azure Active Directory, and give us the client ID and the client secret of that application. Okay, then there could be some mappings for claims, but that is optional. Okay. Once we've done this, we can claim that we can support any identity provider which works with OpenID Connect, which is pretty much the vast majority of the identity providers existing out there, at least the most modern ones. Okay. So this is feature number one. Feature number two, we needed to enforce a provider via a client-specific user flow. What is the user flow in Azure Active Directory? That is feature number two, is the workflow the user has to go through in order to perform an authentication. And in this case, the idea is very similar to the previous one, right? We're going to create separate user flows, right? One for Acme, one for Contoso, right? And in these user flows, we are going to say that the only submitted provider, for example, is Acme Azure AD for the Acme user flow. Okay, that will force the user to authenticate with the Acme provider. And how do we? So this is now a responsibility of the UI to decide which user flow they need to use. And how can we tell it to the UI? Well, that's why we built a configuration API endpoint, isn't it? So we can leverage exactly the same endpoint that we've created before, right? Which is now becoming a little bit more interesting, and saying that if the user comes from Contoso, right, the user flow that needs to be used is this one, B2C one Contoso. Okay, that's the idea. So let's see it in action. Okay, so the code has deployed successfully. Let me open the browser and go to an incognito window, and let me go to acme.enterprisechat.co.uk. Go here, and what is happening now is that the system is going to redirect me to my corporate single sign-on. This is not the same single sign-on that I'll be using in Azure or other. This is my corporate one, right? Where I can just put my password, my username, and I have the password-less authentication. So let me just type 93 in my phone. Hit yes, recognize my face, and yeah, here you go. I'm hopefully logged in as an Acme user. Okay, this is the backend is just starting up. It will take a few seconds because it's called starting, right? But you get the idea. So let's try to do the same thing with Contoso. Let me just open the networking tab so we can have a look at what's happening under the hood, right? If you go to contoso.enterprisechat.co.uk, a very similar thing happens, right? There's this configuration endpoint that is called, right? And this configuration endpoint is now returning that I need to use the Contoso, as you can see, the Contoso login. And now this is redirecting me to Okta, right? Where I can just say, yeah, I'm test user at marcodes.com, whatever, right? And I go back to my application. And now I'm finally logged in as a Contoso user via the Contoso single sign-on platform. Okay, that is perfect. There's only one ingredient which is left. How do we recognize that the user from Contoso is actually a Contoso user? How can we prove it to the backend, right? And this is where the third feature, I have just 1 minute left, but we should be able to do it. The third feature of Azure AD B2C comes into play, right? So what is the idea? As we've seen, Contoso, the blue user, will log in. Azure AD B2C will redirect that user to Okta, right? Now, just before after the authentication, the successful authentication with Okta, but before returning anything back to the browser here, right? Just before that, what we can do with Azure AD B2C is using a feature called the token enrich, in which there could be a server-to-server call between a B2C and, for example, an Azure function or your API, right? Where we get the opportunity of enriching the token with more claims. Now, the idea is that here we will receive the information about the current token that a B2C is retrieving. And we need to recognize that this particular identity provider is actually Contoso. How can we do that? Well, we can just look. Do you remember that I mentioned the metadata URL that our clients need to provide us, right? So in this metadata URL, if we navigate to it, there's a claim which is called issuer. Now, this issuer needs to be unique within this instance of Azure AD, right? So there can't be two identity providers that have the same issuer. So that makes it the perfect key to search on a database, right, on a table, whatever, and link this to Contoso, right? So, okay, this is the issuer. So I think that the company is Contoso. Let's add the Contoso into the claim as a special custom claim company, right? And then we can use that claim, for example, in the backend, right? And replace, you remember that we had that routing-based company context accessor to retrieve the company ID. Now we can instead build a claims company context accessor, which is using that claim that is coming in the token, which is signed by Azure AD and therefore cannot be tampered, right? And then we can potentially add a policy in the code that says companies must match, so that if what I have here is not the same as what I have here, right? The result is that the user is, we think that the user is being quite smart with us, right? But we return a 403 and we don't let him access. Okay, guys, I think that my time is pretty much up. I just want to, I didn't show you code for this, but the code is all available in GitHub. Just a little recap of what we've seen, how to isolate our data in the database with row-level security, how to create and configure the delivery network, especially from the coding perspective, but there are slides that describe how to do that in Azure, how to support single sign-on. There are also a couple of goodies that you might have a look at in the code. For example, well, this access control that we just specified, and how to create new instances, right? We've seen that our delivery network is pretty much independent from the custom domain. So we just needed to configure the security to enable a new customer. So there is a console app that shows how to do that with Graph API. If you have any questions, I will be on Discord. I will be answering them from the next few minutes, or feel free to get in touch with me either in Twitter or by email. And obviously, go and download the code in GitHub that I've used during this presentation, and feel free to use it or take inspiration from it. Thanks very much for having me, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Okay, thank you very much for very interesting talk. We have only one question. This question is mostly like a general one. And on your opinion, what do you think, where we need to create the multi-tenant application, or where we need to do the separated deployment? Because actually in Azure, we can create the multiple resource, multiple database, and really to have like a redirect to different deployments.
So this is a very interesting question. The main differentiator for me is maintainability of the code versus having the benefits of having physical isolation. Obviously, even with row-level security, you're not 100% safe from bugs, right? You can only be safe from bugs with regards to data isolation if you have a physical different infrastructure. But obviously, that has cost implications, has maintainability implications. So it really depends on the type of service that you're using. Generally speaking, for example, if you have a service that is meant to be kind of automatically purchased by your customers with very little manual intervention, even though you could script the entire thing. But probably it would be or if you have many customers, that would make it a maintenance nightmare. I would recommend to use this multi-tenant approach versus the separated. Whereas instead, if you have numbered customers, so which you interact with regularly, that don't require perhaps always the latest upgrades of the code, etc., you can deal with separate resource groups in Azure, for example, and have physical separate infrastructure.
Cool. Thank you a lot. We have one more question from Dima. How to handle local development for multi-tenant application? How we can specify the tenant there and test with different tenants?
Yes, this is a very good question. So it's the reason why I was using the company ID as a parameter, for example, in the query string, right? So that is one option. Or the other thing that you can do is having a specific. What we've done, for example, with in a real world scenario, is having a configuration parameter that is only looked at when the code is in debug mode, right? So you're sure that you can't leak that configuration parameter and use it in production by mistake, and set that for development. The other option that you have is that's the reason why we abstracted the company context accessor in the first place, right? So you can literally have a debug only company context accessor that you set to a specific company ID, which is your test company ID, and it always returns that regardless to query string claims, etc. And it just serves the purpose of local development.
Okay, thank you a lot. Unfortunately, we do not have a lot of time. Thank you a lot for your talk. It was really brilliant. It was really interesting, and it like confirming what we are facing, a lot of developers facing in everyday job.